Thank you for tuning in to Circling Dialogos. I'm the host, Guysengstock, and my conversation today is with Micheal Taft, a longtime meditation teacher, Buddhist practitioner, and much more, including his podcast that has become pretty well known called Deconstructing Yourself. So more context about that conversation in a moment. First, some housekeeping. If you are interested in working with me, coaching and consulting one-on-one, go ahead and email me, and what will happen is we'll set up a consultation call and explore whether or not coaching with me is a good fit for you. Just go ahead and email me. My email is below in the show notes. If you are interested in exploring circling, we have weekends every 4 to 6 weeks. We have the practitioner training course called The Art of Circling, which is basically a year-long program, which is the deep dive. And we have an open event every Thursday evening, 6 to 9 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. And all of that's on Zoom currently. All right, all of that information is below in the show notes. So this was a really, really fascinating conversation with Micheal Taft, and he reluctantly agreed to talk about himself, and I appreciated this. I really appreciated him being willing to kind of walk through his life and share so deeply about basically his historical unfolding. I was curious about that because I had been listening to his podcast for a long time, but really didn't have much of a sense of his own personal journey, if you will. And I wouldn't say he was, as he says in the podcast, it's like his least favorite topic is to talk about himself. So I really appreciated his generosity in this interview together. And you can listen in for yourself, but what I really appreciated was, essentially how deep of a transformation he had pretty early in his life, and the way he related with that transformation. And I think for a lot of people could probably relate to this, where they kind of have a waking up experience, whether it's a positive valence or a negative one, but some kind of waking up to something deeper than, we could say, consensus reality or something like that. And then having very little context in how to relate to that without a tradition or any of that kind of thing. And Micheal really didn't have a tradition for a number of years once that kind of waking up experience happened, and until a few years later in his life. And then we kind of really dive into, his first initial meetings with teachers and communities and all of that. So this was a fascinating interview with a pretty fascinating man, and someone who has become quite well known for his meditation teaching and his social media work with the Deconstructing Yourself podcast. So I really enjoyed this conversation and invite you to enjoy it with me. Thank you so much for tuning in.
I got it.
Welcome.
Thanks, Guy. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm glad that you agreed to do this. I'm looking forward to getting to know you and your life more, and I love the podcast that we did together on your side.
Me too. That was a really great one. Thanks for participating. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. So, I really don't know much about your background at all. I guess we could just start with where are you from? Who did you grow up with? What was it like?
I am from Michigan, and in basically a suburb of Lansing,
Mm-hmm.
and grew up in the days when giant crowds of children would run around a suburb day in and day out, night and day, summer and winter, sort of unimpeded mob of children
Mm-hmm.
with zero adult supervision. So it was a different world.
Hmm. Right. How is family life? And
It was, we were a normal lower middle class family with uh, some real difficulties. So because of tragedies in the family and so on that were causing depression and real struggles for my parents. So there was some very difficult stuff happening there.
right. Got you. And how I know you the most is through your podcast and you as a meditation teacher. How did that Where did that get born? Where did your interest in meditation
Because things were so hard in my family from, basically from birth, more or less. I developed some pretty uh, difficult emotional states by the time I was a teenager without a lot of support. And so I read books and realized, oh, you can work with some of this stuff through through relaxing meditation, mainly sort of yoga nidra type stuff, full body relaxation, things like that. And that really helped, particularly with like crippling anxiety. And that was enough, but also I just recognized that the problem was, if there was a problem, the problem was in my mind, and working with my mind skillfully was going to be the way out. And that turned out to be a good insight for me. Again, sort of unsupported by any help, but just born out of real pain.
Yeah, totally. So like lots of anxiety.
Tremendous. Like lots is an understatement, and when you find some relief, then you really. When I found relief through meditation, I was hooked.
Right. So. Right. Well, it's like I know that for me, like, because I have a background that I grew up in a pretty crazy environment and tons of anxiety disorders and every other kind of emotional disorder you can imagine, right, was either around me or in me. So like I could appreciate the thing about anxiety for me was always this, it put into question this kind of, in a visceral way, this kind of sense of groundlessness that my mind would then try to kind of replace the ground or something like that. What was it like for you, like with the anxiety?
There's a kind of anxiety where you just can't move, physically can't move because you're just frozen in terror, basically, with future possibilities. And that was very uncomfortable. And I just learned to rein in my mind into the present moment. Or actually, I think the original insight, and again, this is me as a kid just figuring it out. It was like, I remember one day just going, don't think about anything that's more than a day away. You can plan, but don't plan more than a day away. Don't worry about anything more than 24 hours from now. And that immediately helped a lot, actually. I was surprised how important that was. And I think later on, in a different phase, I noticed some discomfort with groundlessness, as you describe. But that was easier to work with, actually, for some reason. Whereas this just kind of like other sort of super severe anxiety needed a different take. It wasn't really about groundlessness right there.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. It sounds like it was about how do you make choices and which possibilities do you go into and how do you determine that and that kind of thing.
And all the things that can go wrong at each branching point. And it's sort of like, wow, this is really, this really matters. And at the same time, if you're trying to plan far enough out, it's impossible. And for some reason that was very hard.
Yeah.
But I got through it.
Well, it's impressive.
Figured out a way to work with it.
Strikes me as impressive. Midwest. I grew up in the Midwest as well, just like Midwestern boy, teenager, like by yourself, figuring all this stuff out.
Yeah, especially back then, there you didn't go see a therapist. That did not occur.
Yeah.
And there wasn't a lot of self-help available.
Right.
I think I remember more than self-help, which almost didn't exist. There was a little, wasn't very helpful at all. What was actually helpful, and I know this is comical, was like Llewellyn publisher magic books, like totally crazy magic books in the 1970s style.
Right.
And not the ritual part, not like lighting the candles and anything like that, but just simply before you do all that, they would often have you do a yoga nidra style, full body relaxation visualization. Like, oh, there's this warm light moving through your foot. Now there's warm light moving through your ankle. Now there's warm light. Yeah. And that was like preparatory to doing all the crazy magic shit. Yeah. That part actually worked. That really helped. So
right.
Llewellyn magic book saved my life.
Totally. So there, just the very beginnings of you just found a place where, because the way that the mind can just be like it trying to solve itself by applying more of itself, which is the problem.
Yes.
And you found like little moments and these little things that kind of opened up another possibility that actually made a difference, and that spoke to you.
Yeah, it went into embodiment. It was just, let's focus on embodiment. And those are long meditations. Those are 20, 30 minutes. And I'm a teenager, so that was very helpful.
Right. And so how did you, what happened from there? How did you get into?
The short version is I got very interested in dropping acid and did a lot of that, like a lot of that. And so also as a, not a high school person, but a college person, we got into like tremendously alternative books and that talked about that kind of experience, and read a lot of actual history of that kind of experience, stuff like that. I like to read a lot. And so I got into basically psychedelic stuff and art and painting and playing music and all that. And that was incredibly healing. It really, really helped. And
is this still when you were a teenager?
Well, I'm in college at this point.
Yeah.
So, partially teenage, partially 20s. And by the end of that period, I moved to Japan and started working there teaching English. And this was the 80s. That was an easy job to get. And And it gave me a couple years away where I wasn't doing a bunch of psychedelics and was just integrating, doing tons of meditation, tons of walks out in the mountains, and really just having a good time. It was a real shift, real shift from even college life, which, even though I loved it, was pretty crazy. Japan at that time was, at least for me as a foreigner living there teaching, it was just fabulous. So I stayed there a couple of years, and then came back, changed, pretty deeply changed.
Well, and so that was in Japan. Were you doing like a lot of hallucinogenics there, a lot of acid in Japan, and meditating a lot in between?
There's no hallucinogenics in Japan. That doesn't exist. At least I couldn't find it. Lots and lots and lots and lots of meditating. However, someone sent me some acid from the States, and just once while I was there, and I did that, and that was basically, the huge change in my life. That was probably the biggest change I've ever gone through, that one trip.
Really?
So, yeah.
What was it? What made it so powerful? It made such a big difference.
Even a pretty mild acid trip can show you the emptiness of the sense of self, can show you, the primacy of the mind and things like that. This showed me complete annihilation, followed by the reemergence of the world in a completely new way. And in order to experience that annihilation, I had to kind of give up everything in a final way, and then like everything totally disappeared and then reemerged as a different universe. And that's just never gone away. That's never changed. After that moment, there was like about a year afterwards, where without any psychedelic support or any chemical support of any kind, I was in a radically altered state, like radically altered, for about a year. And then gradually started kind of feeling a little less altered, feeling a little more normal. But the sort of fundamental change that occurred has never unchanged.
Wow.
So that was a big deal.
Yeah. It sounds like sounds terrifying.
Oh, it really was. But it was about as terrifying as something could be. I don't know how something could be more terrifying than that. But the switchover moment was just accepting that completely, without any reservation. It wasn't, sometimes you can accept with a sort of like little spot you're holding out of the acceptance, but this wasn't. You couldn't do that. It was just, okay, I'm going to be annihilated now, and it's real. It's not false annihilation as far as I'm concerned.
Right.
And I don't know if I'll ever come back. Not just die, but be annihilated. And I don't, I think this is probably it. And letting go at that level, and the reemergence from that was, pretty shocking.
Wow.
But the reemergence part was incredibly pleasant.
Yeah.
And very, very sort of kind of like the Avatamsaka Sutra, like the Jewel Ornament Sutra, where just the whole world was incredibly gorgeous. made of jewels, made of light, made of mantras, and that just went on for a year. It was just incredible.
Wow. Do you, when you look back at that experience now, would you say that was that transformational shift, was it a function of how deep you let go?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So if you're scared a little bit and you let go, you transform a little bit. But if it's down to the core and we're talking annihilation, um, with the understanding that you can't undo it. This is it. You will be annihilated. That's the end. And you let go completely enough, you have a kind of total stop of all consciousness.
Mm.
And then something new emerges out of that. A completely different sort of consciousness. I mean, still with the same memories and stuff, of course, but a completely different sort of experience that reemerges out of that.
A different kind of way. Same reality, but completely different way it occurred. It showed itself.
Or different, different experience. And so that, like I say, it's not like I'm seeing everything exactly like that all the time these days, but the fundamental shift stayed. It stuck.
Yeah. And did you, that was when you were in Japan, and then after that, did you do like just a lot of meditation and just trying to ground that or explore that, or what was the?
Oh, it didn't feel like, oh, I need to ground this or something like that. It felt like I just want to sit here and experience this. And I'd go into a lot of absorption states, look at the sky and just merge with the sky for hours and stuff like that. It was very organic. I could still work. I still went to my job and taught, and had a externally I was still doing the same stuff, but I was having a very different internal experience. And so the meditation didn't feel like, oh, the regular Michael, needs to ground this weird thing that happened. Like I say, it was a fundamental shift. So it's like more like whatever this new thing is has to go pretend to do the life a little bit, and then when I get a chance, I can rest back into just this fundamentally different experience.
Right. I've just really, I think I'm struck by what that must have been like for you, especially if
it was great. It was great.
It's like, especially with the with the background of anxiety, right up until that point. I bet it transformed your relationship to anxiety.
Sure. And I mean, of course, I had already done a lot of by this point, this is, 10 years later than that original anxiety issue, from 8 years later or something. So it's, I had done a lot of work with it by then. Doesn't mean anxiety didn't come up, but just my relationship with it was pretty different. So, yeah, I think the most difficult part was not really having any teacher of any kind, and someone who could help me kind of really have a better understanding of what was going on. And I think I took eventually I took like several months off work and just read books about it. That was the only way I could start to understand what was going on.
Do you remember some of the books that you were reading at that time?
Honestly, a lot of them were kind of garbage. When you're in Japan in the 80s, most of what you could get is novels, and Penguin novels, which weren't garbage. Those were great. Like I read all of Hemingway during that time, and all of these classics. I was just loving that. But in terms of any kind of spiritual books or things about meditation. Even though I was in Japan, there was not a lot available in English that was useful. A
Yeah.
lot of it was not useful. Like, let's say I ended up reading all the Carlos Castaneda books, which are just nonsense. I mean, it didn't help.
Right. Right.
I
Totally.
thought, well, this is available. Maybe there's something there. And
Right.
it's like, no, this is fiction. This is obviously fiction.
Yeah.
So, but still, there was. So, in other words, to answer your question, I don't remember anything particularly helping, but
Yeah.
I do remember really good novels,
Yeah.
at least because of their
Yeah.
the theory of mind that's there in a novel,
Yeah.
and the being inside other experiences and stuff. That actually was incredibly rich and deep and beautiful for me. I loved it.
It sounds, get the sense of it was probably like really homing.
Something I like. I like people. I like other minds, and a good novel is about different minds, right? It's revealing minds.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not so much the story or the plot or whatever, but getting inside other experiences.
Yeah.
So that felt very pleasant
Totally.
and rich.
Totally.
So,
And so you, when you were in Japan, you weren't like studying Zen at that time or anything like that formally?
I would go to various Zen monasteries, but I wasn't a monk in the monastery. I'd go and sit there and go, but they're giving the teaching in Japanese, and I didn't understand Japanese that well. But I did like sitting with them.
Yeah.
And there was one Japanese monk. His name was John Toller, and he was a gay man from Texas, from West Texas, like Amarillo or something. And he had lived in Japan in the 60s, and then he was famous for he was an ad executive, and he had made these big, successful ad campaigns. And then he quit and became a Zen monk. And then eventually he had a hermitage way out in Naraken, and which is gorgeous. Naraken is amazing. And so way out there among the rice paddies and mountains and so on, he had a converted farmhouse. It was like this little, it wasn't, I don't think you'd call it a temple. I think you would call it a kind of a hermitage or a little, I don't know, chapel or something.
Yeah.
And so I go out there sometimes and meditate and so on. But I did do a lot of Zen meditation while in Japan, but still not with a teacher as such.
Yeah. 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 So up until this point, you were pretty much doing everything, figuring it out yourself.
I was rolling my own. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
That's interesting. Yeah, that's really, really interesting. And when was the first time you started to actually sync up with a teacher or a tradition? When did that, if that happened, when did that happen?
That would have still been a few years later, coming back from Japan.
Yeah.
Eventually, I started having really strong energy experiences all the time. And in an effort to kind of work with that turns out to be kind of hard to work with on your own. I wouldn't recommend anyone try to do that. And just someone I bumped into.
You mean like kind of jolt of weird sensation going through you and any kind of thing?
I wouldn't call it jolts. I would say, working with Kundalini, that's really happening a lot, like energy stuff, and meditation now causing really strong altered states and so on, but through energy, right? You can feel it in your body and so on in a big way.
Yeah.
And so at that point, I just happened to bump into someone who had been in quite a formal and deep Kundalini tradition, and said, the main teacher of that tradition is going to be in town to do a teaching soon. Why don't you just show up? Just show up. And so I did, and I had to. It's a long story, but I had to move heaven and earth to show up. But for some reason, I was like, I'm going to be there.
Right.
I mean, I had traveled across country in the meantime, but I was like half a continent away, and I got ill, and all this stuff happened. But I was like, I don't care. I'm still getting on the road and getting back there to be at this thing. I was really focused on it, and that turned out to be, that was, a major step. I got involved with this tradition and started learning from a teacher in a formal way. For many years.
And it's a Kundalini yoga. Is that what it was? Or
well, it wasn't like 3HO, people in turbans. No, none of that. It was a Hindu lineage. I would call it. They would not call it this, but I would call it, Hindu Tantra, right? Like, chakras and pranayama and energy and all that kind of stuff. But very, very serious, and also very pure in the right hand sense. So what we would say, not left hand tantra, but right hand tantra. So total vegetarianism, no drugs, no sex, no is really, really strict.
Wow.
In that kind of way, which is like sort of the opposite of everything I had experienced before. So that was interesting. Very powerful. I still know all the people in that group, and and the teacher is my friend. I know them, and it's I would still say that they're just wonderful. Good people, never had a problem. So even though I've personally done a lot of programs talking about the guru relationship and all that, and the problems with it that arise in the West, certainly my personal experience with a guru was pretty much uniformly positive.
Ah, okay. And was that the thing that drew you into it, or had you be so devoted to it? Was it the relationship with the teacher? Was it the
eventually? But the first thing, sorry, I'm interrupting your question. But the first thing was, when you've done a lot of psychedelics and you've done a lot of your own meditation, when something is really happening. Versus when you're pretending that something is happening, or you're imagining it's happening. It's like, no, this is we are on it now. Something's really going on. And what I noticed right away with this particular tradition was when they would say, we're going to do these mantras and something's going to happen, it would. And it wasn't, they weren't kidding around. It was like, and so that really impressed me. I'm like, oh, okay. They say it's going to be like this, and that tends to be what happens. And so I can trust that. This isn't just some kind of imaginary thing. They're working with energy, body prana, they're working with Kundalini, and it's working. The stuff happens.
Wow.
And so that was cool. I like that.
That is cool. That is way cool. Were you at that time, like, what was the structure of it? Did you go and live with them? Were you meditating with them like 5 hours a day? What was the way and what of the practice at that time?
So we're covering a period of like a decade. So there's a lot of different things happening there. Many different things happened, but certainly there were times when, I would go, a whole group would go with them to India and do like a pilgrimage and do all these heavy duty practices. And then eventually, for those who wanted to do it, and I always wanted to do it, you would stay afterwards and do a long retreat, like at least a month, in like very serious retreat conditions. And so you do that over and over, but also at various points live at their house or go to their dad's house or brother's house, all kinds of stuff. So this is why I'm like, I know these people, and they were always really good, or are always really good people. I don't have any
Yeah.
problems with that.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. Wow. And is that where you started? Where did Buddhism specifically start to come online for you?
Well, much earlier, because in college I was attracted to Zen, and I also took classes in Buddhism, at least one, but I think more than one. And that was interesting. My Buddhist, not meditation, but my Buddhist like history teacher was a guy called Paul Muller Ortega, who many years since I've realized is a famous Hindu Tantra teacher in his own right, and has a Sangha and has written books about that. At the time, this is mid 80s, I didn't know who he was. And I didn't realize, he was a religions professor. I really liked him. He was an interesting guy.
Yeah.
So it started out with doing some Zen meditation with a local group, not even with a teacher, but just with sort of like a in-house sitting group, and reading a bunch of the books and taking some classes, but no real meditation teacher, even though I was doing what I considered to be, formal meditation all the time, every day. And then in Japan, of course, I went to a lot of temples and meditated and so on. So there was an interest in Buddhism, but I was having a lot of energy experiences and so on. And, the Zen mood of that is just ignore it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I didn't really know very much about Vajrayana or, Tibetan Buddhism at that point. And so the teachers who would talk about it were Vajrayana is Buddhist Tantra. The people who would talk about it that I met first were Hindu Tantra, and they're like, we're going to work, this is how you work with the energy. Yeah. And so it switched from mainly Buddhist to now really hardcore Hinduism.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. And the Tibetan Buddhism has a lot of Hinduism.
That's not how I would say that.
No, how would you say?
That's not how I would say it. You would say that Tantrism, and this is a controversial way to say it too, but Tantrism is kind of its own thing.
Yeah.
And there's a Hindu version of it and a Buddhist version of it. Okay. And they're, even though philosophically they might be pretty different at times, at least in terms of the practice, they're identical, or almost identical. So, yeah, I got into the Hindu version of Tantra. And so lots of long retreats of doing mantras and doing pranayamas and doing visualizations and doing meditations and stuff like that.
Yeah, totally.
Lots and lots of training in that.
Totally. That must have been like, it sounds like that must have been an incredible base, like all of that discipline and all of that structure and all of those distinctions that I know that it sounds like that they really got deep into must have been just an incredible foundation.
It was, and it was so loving and beautiful. It took over my life for a long time. I ended up really, really going into it with my full being, to the point where I'm like wearing Indian clothes as I walk around the street in America and stuff like that. So I really went there because the way they're teaching it's like not just the meditation time, but every moment of the day, everything you're doing matters to this way of practicing. Right. Every gesture, every word out of your mouth, everything, so it becomes a way of life. And I certainly took it on as a way of life. And that was wonderful. No, it was great.
Yeah, yeah. I It's interesting because I would imagine this, well, also just this backdrop, which is I was struck by your experience in Japan, right? Of this pretty sudden death, rebirth, transformation experience that you had happening pretty all at once in a big way. And then how, just imagining being you of like, okay, where do we go from here? Right?
Yeah.
Like how do you live? What is the basis upon which you live? So I can when you look back at that period of time when you got really devoted, right, in the teaching and were wearing the robes and all that kind of stuff,
They weren't robes, but yeah, okay.
right? Doing fully going into it. Well, you said it was wonderful. Like,
Yeah,
yeah,
of course. It was beautiful. And there's something really uh I don't know. I was never much of a Christian, but you know how if one were to get into Christianity in a deep way, it's like you've got 2,000 years of culture around that, like
yeah,
even plays and symphonies and you know artwork. All of it is embedded in the Christian mythos.
yeah,
And so here I was embedded in a Hindu mythos and not sort of taking it on as some kind of cultural appropriation. I mean, I was just saying, I want to learn. And so Hindu people were bringing me in.
yeah,
And, um, and what I discovered is, oh, in the same way, there's an entire, it's embedded in a cultural context of
yeah.
art and music and story and dance and
Right.
everyday life of all these holidays and rituals and that's just lovely. It was amazing, and I really still deeply appreciate all that stuff.
Mm,
And as you know, because it's a um, because you're traveling and experiencing with other co-practitioners or co-religionists, I get invited into many people's homes and stay with them, and Hindu Indian people's homes, and it was just always very very beautiful and sweet, and the
yeah,
traditions and all that. I really got a lot out of it,
yeah. It's
and
beautiful.
just appreciate that, you know.
It sounds really, really, really gorgeous.
Yeah.
And is that what was happening with the energetic experiences that you're having in your body as time went on? Did those start to dissipate, or did they transform and open up into something else? Or
Well, again, it's a long time period, but I would say that the whole point of that way of working is to get the energy to be more regulated and more. It's getting stronger, but it's also getting less chaotic, more regulated, more smooth, and so on. And so over time, uh, it, what originally was interesting me about working with the energy was that it was difficult to work with because it's powerful, and
yeah,
you can have instant uh, mood changes and stuff that are very hard to work with, and it's not supposed to do that,
yeah,
but it does that when you don't know what you're doing.
right,
And so, excuse me, over time it became much less that way,
yeah,
much more regulated, much smoother, much higher energy.
yeah.
um, yeah, which is, again, it did what it said on the box.
Huh, they really did,
Yeah.
huh? And then so that was that period of time when you were working with those people.
Yes.
My understanding is you go back pretty far in like the whole San Francisco kind of meditation scene, right?
No, I've only been here about 13 years at this point in San
Oh,
Francisco.
okay, got you. So when did Buddhism start to become? Well, actually, when did you start teaching?
Much later,
Hmm.
much later. So there's a whole in-between thing
Hmm.
where the downside of all the work I was doing in Hindu Tantra was that I really, um, um, it's kind of its own self-contained belief system.
Yeah.
And previous to my interest in that, I had been pretty much a I had learned a lot of, um, like in college for a long time, I was doing science stuff and had a lot of exposure to chemistry and physics and mathematics and so on. And I liked all that stuff.
Yeah.
And but also, my degree is in like linguistics and languages
Wow.
and and I like to think of things that way. And something that was odd was not only with the group I was in, but even when I started working at Sounds True and I was publishing lots and lots of spiritual teachers, is that they did not seem to have a good, the ones I was talking to did not seem to have a good um, understanding outside their own tradition of like how all the traditions fit together and what the
Right.
actual original source languages were and what the words in the source languages meant and just all that kind of
Yeah.
uh, um, context that to me was really interesting and I was reading about. But then eventually I remember when I was acquisitions editor early on, I got this cardboard box of cassette tapes, and it was a bunch of early talks by some guy, and I started listening to the talks. And the very first one was a cassette tape called um, Eros and Thanatos,
Mm.
and so I busted that out, and I was listening to it, and I was just utterly like captivated. I'm like, who is this motherfucker? Whoever has made this tape, I got to talk to this guy
Mm.
because it's just amazing.
Mm.
And so we contacted him and uh, decided to publish work with him. And so he came into the studio, and that was Shinzen Young, who became my main teacher at
Oh,
this point.
okay.
And Shinzen is just a different animal. Like,
Yeah.
has studied all the source languages, understands a lot of
Yeah.
sort of ecumenical how these different views can fit together or how they may have influenced each other over time, just and very scientific basis. And it was kind of a huge um, counterbalance to the sort of very, 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 very tradition centric thing I had been in. And it was just what I was looking for. Like, boom, let's spread
Wow.
out from here. So because of my job at that point, which I moved on to being the editorial director at Sounds True, so I was in charge of all the stuff we were publishing. The publisher's in charge, but then I'm sort of making it all
Yeah.
and helping to bring it in. And I got the chance to edit like 50 solid hours of Shinzen talking
Wow.
down into like 16 hours or something. But I just listened to this brain dump he did, which became a program called the Science of Enlightenment, which is still being published. Like it's still out there.
Yeah.
And that for me was like, okay, I got to go study with this guy. And even though he's kind of a scientist and kind of a generalist in terms of spirituality, he is a Buddhist. And so I got back into the Buddhist end of sitting.
Wow. Wow. And what was it about for you? What was it about him that was the difference, made the difference for you? And in going in that direction?
Sure. Well, it's everything I just mentioned, going from instead of being encapsulated in a religious Hindu worldview where things like, where it's as magical as it can possibly be. And Lord Ram 25,000 years ago had nuclear weapons and, just like a belief system like that. Shinzen was just the opposite. Like, we're going to be scientific and rational and talk about history and talk about different languages and talk about different religions. And I was just ready for that because that's more how my mind works.
Right.
And so it was like, oh, here's someone who actually knows, who's a very deep meditator, but who's coming from a really different perspective. And I was ready to shift into that different perspective. So I just fully went there.
Yeah, I can get that sense of it. It just seemed like this other thing was just really ripened you to such a big degree. And then, however, more of the kind of like the intellectual or the scientific, right?
Yeah, and it just a big part of my being needed to work in a different way. And so I had sort of taken that in my opinion, as far as I could take it.
Yeah.
And for the moment, I'm going to take this off. Hang on.
Yeah.
There we go.
And
getting a little warm. The sun's finally coming out.
So we're working with him. What did that mean at first? Did you like go and just doing like lots of retreats with him? Did you go and live with him?
No, you don't live with Shinzen. It basically meant doing a lot of retreats, but I had a special position or a special opportunity, is how I should put it, because I had edited that Science of Enlightenment program, and then we wanted, even after I left the company, they wanted to turn that into a book. And since I had worked so hard on the editing, they wanted me to write that book. And so I got a chance to, through that, besides going to a lot of retreats, that gave me an opportunity to talk one-on-one with Shinzen a lot, hours and hours and hours and hours and hours and hours and hours about these concepts in the book. And it ended up, we thought, we'd do it in about 6 months. It ended up taking 12 years to write that book. Yeah.
Wow.
It did get done, though. I have to say it got done. It just took a little
basically a 12-year conversation.
Yes. Yeah.
That sounds incredible.
It was incredibly painful, but yes, also incredibly wonderful.
Yeah.
Not painful between me and Shinzen, but I mean,
right.
Yeah, just to get that out.
Right, in the full sense of the word.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, but that was cool. It meant that not only doing lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of Shinzen retreats, but also being in dialogue about his ideas and his method and where everything's coming from, stuff like that. So I got kind of a more complete education in that I would have got otherwise.
Yeah. I bet it was pretty deep. And those, and is that, when did you start teaching meditation?
Later, because from my background with the Hindu Tantra and that guru scene, the idea of being a teacher was very elevated.
Yeah.
Not just anybody can be a teacher, and you are, it's a very big deal to just say, I'm going to teach meditation. So I wasn't doing that. And then eventually, there was a group in LA. Some of my friends were in an AA group. I was not in the group, but some of my friends were in the group, and they were like, look, can you teach us to meditate? And I was like, no. But then it just started to seem like ridiculous. Like, you're not supposed to teach because that's arrogant, but isn't it even kind of more arrogant to say no? Because
Yeah.
I don't know, it just seemed like ridiculous at a certain point. These people weren't asking me to be their guru or something, just simply to show them how to meditate.
Yeah.
And so I started working with just the loveliest group of folks in Los Feliz in LA. And that became kind of a thing. There was a lot of people coming, and it was popular enough that then I started teaching at Against the Stream in LA on Melrose, and teaching just kind of took off after that. I love teaching, and I had spent so many decades learning all this material that when I finally did teach, there was a lot there, and I dove in a big way. It
Right.
kind of really took off. But so I didn't start teaching until, let me try to do the math here. I bet I was about 45.
Yeah. Wow. So I would imagine
43, something like that. But it wasn't like what I see happening a lot these days is, oh, I've been meditating for 5 years and I'm going to be a teacher now. And I'm like, okay. It does. I'm not against it. I mean, people showing other people how to meditate is good, but I was sort of the opposite. Not like, oh, I've kind of learned this thing, I want to. It was more like,
right.
well, I've spent an entire lifetime learning this, and now people are really asking me, and so okay, I'll do it.
Yeah. So interesting. It just seems I've through this conversation so far, I've thought about this a number of times with when I was in art school. You could always like I got in, I think a year or two before they switched admissions. So you like when I got in, you had to give your slides, you had to, evaluate you as competitive, all this kind of stuff. And then at some point that they needed money or something, and it changed.
They just needed students, yeah.
And you could totally tell the difference. And the big difference was that people, like, you could take the most abstract kind of painter, but if they have a classically trained background, right, then they go like this, versus when somebody has no training in any of the basics, right, goes like this. It's completely different.
It's completely different. I
really
remember that really famous moment where, these journalists are watching Picasso as an old man. I think he was making plates. Actually, he was doing some ceramic work with fish bones and these plates. It's really cool. And he did it really fast. And they were like, wow, you did that in 2 minutes. And it's gorgeous. And he just famously said, it took me 80 years to do that in 2 minutes.
Yeah.
It's like having that kind of training,
right,
is different. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. It just seems like your life in spirituality and meditation seems to be, it seems to go real deep, and it seems unusual to me, just that you had that opportunity to be so surrendered into a tradition in Hinduism, and then having this kind of opening with Shinzen, right, and starting to have more of the intellectual kinds of stuff and the cross spirituality kind of integration things that he was into, right? That seemed like a blossoming. And then when you started teaching, I could just imagine it, just after all of those years and all of that practice and all of those distinctions, right, that you must have been dwelled, like you dwelled in and they indwelled you. When you finally kind of taught, it must have just been amazing. Like,
I mean, for me, it just felt like there was a lot there to share, and I really wanted to share it.
Yeah. Totally.
And the group was amazing. The group was very special, and several of those people from that group ended up becoming meditation teachers. good meditation teachers and so on over the years. So
Yeah.
it was a real interesting time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And like, God, there's so much I want to ask you about that with teaching. Like the that you want to share. There's so much that you wanted to share, you just said, right? The sharing of it. What was the experience like for you when you first started teaching? Like, did you kind of just have people kind of come into the room and you just started to talk about the breath? Was it like, how did you come to teach? This is kind of a broad question, but
Well, I mean, I just started with the basics because most of those people had not meditated before.
yeah.
And so just started doing pretty standard Shinzen style teaching, sort of using his system.
Yeah.
And he did authorize me to teach. He was like, okay, you can teach this. And so that part was pretty straightforward. I think what's interesting, in my opinion anyway, is that you ever see those movies like the 21 up and 28 up and 35 up? You ever see that series?
Yeah. Yeah.
Remember that the original conception was whatever you do until you're 7 is what what you end up doing, right?
Right.
And that was the point of following people, is watching them as little kids, what games they're playing and stuff, and you see then what they become in life.
Yeah.
And so my parents, my dad's a teacher and my mom's a librarian, and I have older sisters, and one of them, she had like a blackboard, a child's play blackboard and chalk and a school chair. And so she played teacher to me while I was like 3 and 4 and stuff. So I played the student and would sit there with her. And so I actually had learned to read before I went to school and stuff, because that was the game we played all the time, is school.
Yeah.
But then when I went to school, I played a weird game in my mind every single day, which was, once I would understand what the teacher was saying, I played the game of, what if I were the teacher? How would I say it? And so I was always rehearsing in my mind, teaching whatever I was learning my whole childhood. And so, there's kind of two things to anything you're teaching. One is like how well you know that material or how good you are at it or whatever. But then I think there's another thing, which is just how good are you at teaching stuff?
Yeah. Yeah.
And like, there's a lot of people who are really good, I don't know, musicians, but they suck at teaching it.
Totally.
Right. They just know how to play it. Yeah. But there's also people who, are really good teachers of music who might not be that good at it. So it's like a separate skill, right?
Yeah, totally.
But so my whole childhood was imagining teaching and pretending to teach and visualizing teaching and thinking of explaining stuff to other people. And so, so that quality for me was home base, like,
native ground.
Sharing, like I'm explaining this stuff to other people, and that just seemed really natural to me.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't say I'm the world's best meditator or anything like that, but I guarantee I can teach people how to meditate.
Yeah. Yeah.
And get really good results in teaching.
Right.
I know that for sure.
Right. Totally. Yeah. I mean, I've well, you wrote what's the name of the book that you wrote again? Is it something Buddhist Geeks?
No, that's Vincent Horn. He has a whole, world called Buddhist Geeks. He and Ryan Olke. Um, yeah, but I wrote a book called The Mindful Geek,
Oh, the Mindful Geek
and so yeah, yeah.
or something like the Mindful Geek. The did you when did you write that book?
Oh, about 2015 or so.
20.
More like 2014, and it came out in 2015.
Yeah, yeah. And is that basically the way that that book unfolds? Is it similar to the way that you teach?
Not anymore.
No.
That book is mainly about how to do secular mindfulness, following mainly kind of Shinzen methods, but also my own weird changes and adaptations to that. But it's highly it's very focused on basic meditation techniques that would lead you into kind of a strong mindfulness practice that you could eventually turn into a vipassana practice and so on.
Right.
Pretty basic, but trying to explain meditation to, people at Google or people at Apple, things like that, where it's really, really, really secularized and yet maintains the core, the important parts of what meditation is trying to do.
Yeah.
And so because I had been teaching a lot at corporations and meeting a lot of people who were not interested in the religious side at all, and I had been studying a lot of, on my own and going to conferences and talking with people quite a bit about the sort of neuroscience end of meditation and things like that. It's presented in a very, very secular style, but also not even really the stuff that these days I'm teaching, which is more Vajrayana, the Buddhist Tantra style, even though, again, I've also heavily adapted that and secularized it.
Yeah, totally. And the turn in terms of your teaching with the Vajrayana, when did that happen?
Oh, probably 15 years ago, but it's been a long time kind of incubating and working on it and bringing it to the surface. And that came out of taking the Shinzen style meditation quite a bit further on my own, so at a certain point Shinzen kind of cuts you loose and is like, okay, I've taught you these ways of meditating, you know what you're doing now, go do it. And so that really how in painting you have a painting practice, right? It's not about necessarily making any particular painting that is an opus. It's about every day you're painting and you're following the practice, right? And so I had learned all this stuff, and it's like, okay, I'm just going to follow it by meditating every day and follow the practice, follow where it's guiding me. And in a really unusual and interesting way, it led me into the non-dual Vajrayana type stuff. I just didn't know it. I kind of arrived there in a totally different way, independently, thinking I had discovered something, honestly.
Oh, really?
And,
oh, interesting.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, because it was like, whoa, what is this? This is really interesting. And then realizing over time that, there's no, in fact, this is a whole other way, tradition. And so learning.
That's interesting. So you kind of walked your way, you stumbled across it on your own, not having.
I mean,
It's not,
on my own, I, of course,
yeah,
with a lot of support and also a huge background in Hindu Tantra,
totally.
but yeah, by iterating on the deep meditation work, if you just iterate on that, you end up, it takes you somewhere, right? That's the promise, and it does do that. So that was really, really fun and interesting, although kind of kind of a shocker when I realized, wait a minute, you know, there's a whole tradition of the stuff I'm talking about now. This new stuff turns out to be uh, traditional,
Yeah,
and so it's like, oh, okay, so let's look at what that's about.
yeah. Oh, that's really interesting. So, what were some of the things that you were experiencing that were like, oh, I thought I was discovering something here? What were those kinds of experiences that you were having?
It's not about experience; it's about view. So
You,
um, like where you're coming from with your meditation
right?
starts to change and more deeply. And so over time, meditation experience is not the interesting part, it's the view part that's interesting, where you're coming from.
Right.
And that's what's changing.
Yeah.
And um, it led me to see really, really deeply, with a lot of clarity and precision, the constructed nature of all of experience, which of course I had read about a lot, but since I backed my way in there in this very idiosyncratic personal practice way,
Yeah.
it was like uh, um, really interesting and harkened back to the early
Yeah.
psychedelic stuff and all kinds of things that I already knew in a different way.
Yeah.
But now it was like, oh, wait a minute,
Yeah.
like, oh,
Right.
and so that nature of mind, style, material,
Yeah.
um, uh, I didn't realize I was learning the same stuff because I came at it from such a funny angle.
Yeah. Yeah. Totally.
But then once I was like, oh, of course. And then, then kind of made the translation. But it was interesting to get there that way.
Yeah.
So,
That is really interesting. That's fascinating. And the in Vajrayana, for those people who aren't familiar, is there like a way of kind of bottom lining the essence of Vajrayana practice?
well, the important thing is the nature of mind. So just understanding that, you
Yeah.
know, um, all experience is uh, um, that that awareness itself, that pure, primordially pure awareness, is
Yeah.
kind of inseparable from all the appearance and awareness.
Yeah.
Those two things are a unity, right?
Yeah.
Emptiness and experience are a unity.
Yeah.
And so it starts out with kind of the emptiness part where you start noticing that uh, almost like in a brain in a fish tank kind of way, a brain in a vat way, like all experiences just arising in awareness, all of it, including the sense of me, including all thought. So tons of that had been obvious already, but it just arose in a new way. And
Mm.
then the further point that that's not separable from the awareness itself. The experience is not separable in any way from the awareness of the experience.
Mm.
And so instead of like observer and observed, there's just this experience, right? And
Yeah.
it's not that somehow the awareness even is primary, because the appearance is permanently wedded with the awareness of appearance. So that's I don't know if now that I've said I'm a great teacher, I just said something probably incomprehensible. But the bottom line is that understanding that nature of mind,
Yeah.
the union of of primordial awareness with
Right.
spontaneous display, continuous display.
Yeah, totally. And that there's not one that it's not like appearance happens in awareness.
Exactly.
It's like the appearance itself is made of awareness.
Awareness or the other, yeah, they're both one thing.
Yeah.
And that's crucial.
Yeah.
And that removes either side of the equation. It's not like there's an experiencer experiencing this object. Those are collapsed into just a unified awareness of and appearance that come together. They're constantly together.
Yeah.
And
God,
that's,
that sounds
in other
so.
words, it's just kind of pure experience.
Yeah.
Everything is just pure experience.
That sounds so. That sounds like so much fun to to teach. It's just so
Yeah, I mean, I love teaching it. It's just so what?
rich to me.
It's very rich. Yeah. Yeah. And it's the kind of thing that in a way you can sort of intuitively understand and point out. Someone can have it pointed out to them on the first day of meditating, really, and they'll kind of get it. But then walking into that in a stable, deep, rich way can take a while.
Yeah. And the thing that takes a while is the view. That distinction. You made that distinction. It's like you said, not experience. It's not experience. It's the the view.
Yeah. So in other words, um, maybe anybody could see a rainbow and have an experience of a rainbow,
Yeah.
or see a tree and have an experience of a tree. But they're experiencing it from a different view, meaning um, I'm a solid me and the tree is a solid tree, and we're having this kind of viewer viewed interaction. Whereas, perceiver and perceived interaction that is dualistic, eventually we bring those two together into pure experience.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's how the view changes. Even who you think you are changes entirely, right? So where you're coming from changes entirely.
Right.
Yeah.
And is that when you talk about pointing out practices, right?
Yeah. So that's, the teacher's saying, okay, notice this about experience right now. Now notice this other thing. Can you see this part? And even a rank beginner can be like, yeah, I kind of do. And it's like, there you go. Now you're starting to see it. I mean, the thing here is like, I may be the slowest student in human history because really took me a long time to get to this stuff. Whereas if you were in a Vajrayana tradition or whatever, this might be day one, in terms of at least the knowledge part of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Seems like it seems it's interesting. It just seems so rich to kind of come into this after all this experience and then and not even quite realize what you were kind of walking into, and then having all the distinctions come in. I just bet on some level it just seems like such a unique and cool experience that it probably like gives an angle on things. It's probably unique.
Everyone's angle on things is unique, right? And yes, certainly this is I'm able to teach this material in a pretty unusual manner,
Right.
because I've had to learn it kind of in 6 different ways.
Yeah.
And so that's why, most of my teaching is not in groups, it's one-on-one. And so I kind of figure out where the person is coming from, which is, that's the joy of that, is like, oh, encountering the other mind, understanding where the mind is coming from, and then working not to get, oh, here's my perfect way of describing this and you must understand it no matter where you're coming from. It's just the opposite. It's like, okay, where is this person coming from? And how can we help them to realize this view in their way?
Yeah. Yeah.
organic to them in a way that makes sense. And that to me, that's fun and interesting. Like
Yeah.
sitting here spending 90 minutes talking about myself, uh, that's not interesting.
Yeah.
But like, oh, what's going on in this mind? And oh, okay, how's it, what's its view? Where is it coming from? And how's it see the world? And
Yeah.
what's this person? It's not just mind. I mean, the embodied experience, their emotions, all of that. Where are they coming from? And then how, based on what they want, their goals and stuff, how can we kind of come together
Right.
in a way that's enriching for both of us?
Right.
That's really fun and interesting.
And and you work one-on-one with people in like that.
Yeah, I have big group teachings that are basically free or donation, and then online courses that people pay for, but also if people really want to go there, go into like one-on-one teaching. And
Mm.
to me, there's not one thing people are supposed to learn or one way to learn it. It's like, okay, my first questions are, why are you here? What do you want to learn? What do you want to get out of this? And based on their response and me sort of tuning into that kind of unique view of things, figuring out, okay,
Mm.
this is how we're going to work for a while, and starting to feel our way into what might be important
Mm.
um, uh, milestones towards achieving what they want to achieve.
Well, seems just your description reminds me a lot of circling, actually, of like kind of really getting someone else's world in a real deep way.
Yeah, that's my jam. I like getting someone else's world in a deep way.
Yeah.
That's fun
Yeah.
and really actually interesting and beautiful and rich, right?
Yeah.
Um, I'm not that interested in jamming my concepts down somebody's throat. That's just not any fun.
A lot of sense.
Um, and I don't think it really helps anybody.
Yeah. And what you're talking about sounds more like kind of just meeting the person where they're at, and then just starting to open in the contours and the ways that that particular being is inclined to open.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a little more directed because they want to learn something out of the interaction. So the unfolding is in what I perceive
Yeah.
is this kind of like path towards that based on what I'm hearing
Yeah.
or seeing in their experience,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So it's not quite just exploration, but it certainly has the explorative
Yeah.
unfolding component.
Right. And the subtle nuances of just must be, God, that sounds so much fun.
Yeah. No, when you describe circling, I'm like, okay, he gets that thing. Like
Yeah.
you get that thing of what it's like to really meet another being and sort of explore,
Right.
and that to me, as I just keep saying over and over, that's interesting. That's why even novels are interesting,
Yeah.
as I said early on. And there's something about that is
Mm.
it's, of course, that's not Buddhism. That's present in everywhere. That's present in any human endeavor.
Yeah.
um, and it has that quality of it's not even human endeavor, because you can have that same experience with animals. And so in any sentient endeavor, you can come into a kind of a deep knowing
Yeah.
that is lovely.
Totally. Yeah. And intimate. And
Yes.
because one of the things that strikes me is that people's, like kind of really getting where people are coming from, right? In the world, when they look out, what they're actually seeing, um, is that whatever it is, it has a perspective, right? That very perspective seems to is tied to like it's just infinitely deep what's involved in someone having a perspective, right? Historically, like emotionally, right? Culturally, these deeper levels of context. There's so much that goes on in just somebody taking a perspective, right? That it's kind of, it's a beautifully it's inexhaustible in some sense.
Inexhaustible. And that's the thing that we would call view, the perspective from which someone is coming.
Yeah.
That's the thing that actually meditation changes.
Yeah.
What people come in thinking it's going to change is they're going to have new ideas and understanding and experiences from their perspective, but it's like, no, the perspective is the thing that it's changing.
Yeah. Yeah. Because it's funny, because if you, was it Gregory Bateson said that all behavior is a function of perception. Like usually people usually think about it like this, but there's all of our actions, that internal actions, right? Thoughts, feelings, and external actions, speaking and movement, are always in correlation with occurring, right? How the world is showing up, which is a function of our perspective. So it's kind of like if you shift the shift in perspective happens, like all of your actions will be in correlation with that as well. It's like,
that's right. And all of experience will shift, everything shifts.
Yeah,
everything. The perspective shift is the fundamental one.
Yeah. That's so rich. So thank you, my friend. This was really great. I appreciate you doing the biographical thing for a little bit. I was curious about that.
You're very welcome, Guy. It's so much fun to come and speak with you. And again, even though it's not my favorite topic, it's certainly fun to talk about it with you.
Yeah, so, absolutely.
Thanks for your interest and your time.
Yeah, totally. And just so for people, if they want to explore your work and get a hold of you and your classes and stuff like that, where should they go?
Sure, they should go to deconstructingyourself.com. Let's just go there. You'll find all the stuff, all the things.
Okay. Right on. Here's all the things.
All the things. See you, man.
Thank you.
Have a great one.
Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot. Bye now.